When the war ended, the world expected relief to feel like peace. Instead, it felt like exhaustion that never lifted. Trains carried soldiers home across broken countries. Their uniforms faded, their eyes older than their years. They returned to streets that looked familiar but felt distant, as if the war had shifted everything slightly out of place. People cheered, bands played, flags waved, yet behind the smiles there was confusion. Everyone sensed that something had gone terribly wrong, and no one knew how to fix it. Thomas Hale stepped off the train with a limp that would never fully leave him. The platform smelled of coal and rain. His mother stood waiting, thinner than he remembered, her hands trembling as she touched his face to make sure he was real. She spoke, but he struggled to hear her words clearly. Loud noises still made his heart race. Every sudden sound pulled him back to the trenches, to shells falling from an invisible sky. That night, as he lay in his childhood bed, sleep refused to come. When it finally did, it brought mud, smoke, and screaming with it. Across Europe, millions tried to rebuild their lives. Factories reopened, fields were replanted, and governments spoke of a new era. But the ground itself seemed to remember the war. In France and Belgium, farmers plowed up bones instead of crops. Entire villages had vanished, erased so completely that maps no longer matched reality. Children grew up playing near rusting shells, unaware that touching them could mean death. The men who had fought struggled the most. Some drank to forget, others withdrew into silence. Many could not explain what haunted them, only that something inside them had broken. Doctors called it shell shock, but naming it did not cure it. Nightmares were common, sudden rages, shaking hands, blank stares. Families learned to live with men who had returned alive but not whole. While ordinary people tried to survive, leaders gathered in grand halls to decide the future. They spoke of justice and security, of preventing another war. The treaty they created punished the defeated harshly, stripping land, wealth, and dignity. New borders were drawn with straight lines that ignored history, culture, and people. Nations were created overnight, fragile and resentful. The victors believed strength would guarantee peace. They did not understand how deeply humiliation could cut. In Germany, anger spread quietly. Veterans returned to empty jobs and broken promises. Inflation erased savings. Food was scarce. Many felt betrayed, convinced the war had been lost not on the battlefield but at home. Among them was a former soldier who spent his nights raging against the world, blaming enemies both real and imagined. He listened carefully, learned to speak with fire, and found others who shared his fury. Far to the east, revolutions reshaped entire societies. Empires collapsed. Under the weight of war and hunger, new governments rose, promising equality and justice, while silencing those who disagreed. Fear and hope mixed together, creating unstable nations that watched one another closely. The world had survived the war, but it stood on uneven ground. Thomas tried to build a normal life. He found work, though standing for long hours caused pain to shoot through his leg. He smiled when expected, laughed at the right moments, and said little about the past. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he took out the letter he had written in the trench and never sent. The paper was stained and creased. He read it slowly, remembering the boy who had written it, the one who believed the war would end soon. That boy felt like a stranger. Years passed. The memory of the war faded for those who had not lived it. For others, it never faded at all. Memorials were built in town squares, lists of names carved into stone. On anniversaries, people gathered to remember the dead. Trumpets played, wreaths were laid, silence followed. Then life continued as if remembrance itself had limits. In the 1920s, the world tried to convince itself it had learned its lesson. Technology advanced, cities grew, music and laughter returned. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered, old rivalries remained unresolved, new hatreds formed. Economic crises swept through nations, turning hope into desperation. Extremes began to feel reasonable to those with nothing left to lose. Thomas watched these changes with unease. He read newspapers filled with angry speeches and marching crowds. The language felt familiar, uncomfortably so. He had heard it before, shouted by officers urging men out of trenches, promising victory just beyond the next hill. He recognized the tone, the certainty, the refusal to doubt. It frightened him more than shells ever had. One evening, as he walked home, fireworks exploded in the distance, celebrating some political victory. The sudden blast sent him diving for cover, his heart pounding. People stared. Someone laughed nervously. Thomas stood slowly, embarrassed and shaking. In that moment, he understood that the war was not behind him. It never would be. Across borders, armies quietly trained again. Factories that once made farming tools began producing weapons. Governments spoke of defense while preparing for offense. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten. Each nation told itself it was only protecting its future. Few admitted they were preparing for another disaster. By the early 1930s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Economic collapse pushed millions into poverty. Desperate people listened to leaders who promised strength, unity, and revenge. Flags filled streets once more. Uniforms returned. The sound of marching echoed through cities that had sworn never to hear it again. Thomas grew older, his hair streaked with gray. He followed events closely, with dread settling deep in his chest. He saw young men filled with the same excitement he once had, the same belief that war would give their lives meaning. He wanted to stop them, to explain what waited beyond the speeches and parades. But he knew they would not listen. No one ever did. The world stood at the edge again, pretending it was not. The wounds of the First War had never healed. They had only been covered. Beneath them, infections spread quietly, waiting for the chance to break free. And as clouds gathered over Europe once more, the survivors of the last war understood the terrible truth, the conflict that was supposed to end. All wars had instead taught humanity how to begin the next one.